Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode. Very important because we have a lot of political problem around the world. Could AI fix politics? We have our world famous speaker, Professor Rob, Professor David Smith, and Mr. Martian. Professor Rob, this week actually you share all of your idea for arranging this open dialogue. There are a lot of controversy, lot of interesting thing happening in social media this week for this week discussion. So, what you want to add for today's session?
Well, I think today what we're talking about AI as applied to politics, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So the artificial intelligence is a tool, like anything else. A tool can be used for good or ill, and artificial intelligence has the promise of providing any leader, whether it's a business leader or a political leader, with the information that they need to make a more informed decision. But the leader has to want a more informed decision. Often the case is leadership, and this happens both in the public and private world, that made the decision or they decided what they want to do, and they only want information that now supports the decision they've already made. AI could be used that way as well, but it would be an appropriate use of AI in that case, because all it does then is if the decision was a bad one, it would provide a substantial amount of evidence of why it is not a bad one. Why in fact the individual made the right decision, but maybe something else happened that caused it to go badly. So more a shifting of blame and a validation of something that shouldn't have been done in the first place. And so care has to be taken with any digital tool to assume that it's assisting in making the right decision and not reaffirming the wrong decision or providing a mechanism for assigning blame where blame doesn't belong. And often the blame belongs in the fact that the decision was made before the research was done. One of the biggest decisions I was involved in that was done that way was when IBM sold off Rome Systems. I was part of competitive analysis at the time, and we'd been structured to do the research and decide which of two companies the firm should sell to. And we turned in our report a week early, only to find the decision had made the week before that, and the decision had gone exactly the opposite of where we were recommending. And as we forecast, it ended up very badly for the unit, causing the unit to fail after it was sold. And it was a horrible deal for IBM, all told. But that showcases some of the issues. And while I was at IBM, there were two competitive analysis groups that were competing. My group, which reported to marketing, and another group that reported to sales. The sales group predominantly was focused on always saying the best about our products and showing them in the most positive light. Our group was missioned to actually show how the products showed up competitively, and at the time they weren't very competitive at all. But management decided between the two groups, the one that they really wanted to fully fund was the one that was promoting the sale of the product and covering up the problems, not the one that was highlighting the problems. And the end result, as they say, the unit collapsed, eventually had to be shut down. And I saw that repeatedly throughout my career on and off in large companies. And I think it just showcases the critical need to make sure that information tools are focused on providing the information decision makers need to have before making the decision. And the effort to use those same tools to validate a decision after the fact can be incredibly damaging and destructive to the company or the country that uses the tool. So AI can be used to help any leader make better decisions. The risk is the tendency is going to be to use it to validate a bad decision that has already been made and to shift blame where blame probably does not belong. And avoiding that latter outcome should be a critical focus of these artificial intelligence efforts.
Thank you. Professor David Smith. Can you hear me?
I can. So to me, the use of artificial intelligence in politics is an interesting one, because in the government today, we already see a lot of artificial intelligence being used. However, it's just not used in the governance process. And that's the area where I think we really need to look at how to write algorithms that really work for governance. The the political stakeholder environment is so complex that to collect sentiment analysis across all of your constituents is going to be a challenge, really, when you get to this. I can use artificial intelligence with sources to look at sentiments across the nation. I can use social media as an input. I can use the press as an input. I can use others. But so many of the issues you see in the political environment actually go to things that don't make it to the press, and that
Yes, doing this from an automobile has its risks.
Okay.
Yeah.
We may want to shift to Marshall until David
Yes.
gets back in
Mr.
range.
Marshall, yeah.
Well, Sharif, I was in the driver's seat yesterday with David. Here he goes. Anyway, and I think I had the same problem as he has now, but I'm not in the driver's seat right now. With regard to artificial intelligence, in my community here in the United States, I participated on what we call a county-wide board and a village board for several years, about 5 years for each position. And just the political decision-making between the parties, it has nothing to do with artificial intelligence, in my opinion, except for maybe the politicians are artificial. But that's a pun. In any case, the actual use of artificial intelligence in political decision-making is only as good, I think, as Rob and David have both pointed out. It's only as good as what people are finding as the people using it. And we have issues in the United States, and I'm sure in other places around the world. If you take a look at the police function in a democracy, nothing is 100% pure. So what we have is we have a quasi-democratic process when it comes to policing in many states and many counties in the United States. And if you start to go into the developing world, you see the same thing. So just using artificial intelligence to manage police blotters or to find criminals, the question is, who are the people using this and for what purpose and what end? I think the artificial intelligence is a tool. It can help us make a lot of decision-making process quicker, more rapid. But I think, as kind of Rob pointed out, now I'm getting a call from somebody else. As we're getting downloads from people around the world, the world is getting smaller, but then it means that information is being used in ways that could be what we call nefarious methodologies, as opposed to useful ideas. If the intention is to, let's say, use artificial intelligence for political decision-making, considering the use of what we call the climate crisis, then and we're using science-based data to get things done, that's one thing. But politics is an animal of its own breed. And in many countries around the world, democratic countries, non-democratic countries, the use of artificial intelligence, it could be problematic. That's all I'm going to say at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor David Smith.
Sorry. In the car, the internet can be problematic. The other place with artificial intelligence, though, in politics, is we see it already employed a whole bunch in campaigning and the different elements there. But then some of the other places in politics where you can take some of the nuances of AI, such as use the image recognition as you begin to look at people in a campaign rally and begin to read in real time how they're reacting to your speeches and plug that back in. You see artificial intelligence being used in campaigns for issue analysis, for competitive analysis against your competitors. So that is where you're seeing it today. Where we have not seen it, like I said earlier, applied very much at all, is to the governance process and the lawmaking process itself. And I believe that is will be coming down the road. But it also begins to say, how does the role of legislation change? Will artificial intelligence remove the impact of lobbyists? And will it supplement that and make it a more level playing field? I'm not for sure. You know, we need to, if we're using artificial intelligence in governance, really work to understand its biases. Because the bias, we know AI is biased today. And if we're using it to make our laws, I would, as a voter, want to understand what the bias is and see if we need to look at and use AI in a sense for one type of law and maybe not for another type of law. So that's kind of my thoughts right now.
Thank you, Professor Rob. Politics has many problems, already is proven. Uh,
Yep.
do you believe that in terms of decision making, when political heads take the decisions, AI can help or they can improve the decision making of the politician?
Well, yeah. I mean, what AI does, if it's done properly, is it provides you insight into the data that is underneath and supporting it. As long as that data is unbiased, then the advice it provides will be unbiased as well. Assuring the data is unbiased is a significant problem the industry's been taken on over the last couple of decades. But the policies and practices still have to be applied. And there is certainly an opportunity for an AI to tell a politician what his constituency wants with regard to a particular decision. But as David pointed out, the dynamic, I'm assuming the dynamic in the United States, is that large companies have an inordinate amount of influence on those politicians, and they may not really care as much about their constituency as a result. The lobbying is arguably out of hand here, and the financial resources that a lobbyist can bring forward can easily overwhelm the intelligence resources that AI can provide, because an AI is not going to, drop a check into the campaign if you do what the AI advises. And so it comes down to an AI may be better used for compliance to assure the politicians are in line with their constituency, and to highlight areas where they have drifted far afield from what the people that voted for them and the people that they represent, which often aren't the same people, actually want. So AI can be an incredible tool, but we have to recognize that we're applying it to a process that has been inherently corrupt for a long period of time, and unless you can mitigate that corruption, AI by itself is not in a position to do it itself. I mean, outside of a Terminator kind of scenario where the AI goes rogue and decides to start doing things on its own, which is possible, but unlikely near term. It really would require the focus on the implementation be that goal, to make sure that the AI is providing the political decision maker with the information they need. More likely, it would be effective in the bureaucracy of government, where you've got salaried people just trying to do a job, identifying people that aren't paying their taxes, identifying criminals, particularly criminals that are operating, Ponzi schemes or other fraudulent activities. AI could be really good at identifying those folks and then putting law enforcement and organizing the case and then putting law enforcement on it. AI could be particularly effective in the judicial bodies, because the judicial body uses both case law and the written word to define and decide on a case. That's relatively straightforward, and an AI can certainly help a judge. And judges are often overwhelmed and understaffed and under-resourced, reach a much more solid judgment based on the law of the land and previous rulings. So it may have a stronger application, or perhaps a more effective application, with career bureaucrats and in the judicial and law enforcement areas of government, where it's less likely it would be easily compromised. But in all cases, you'd have to focus on ensuring that compromise didn't take place, and you might actually need some type of an AI auditing facility to go in and look to make sure that the AIs weren't compromised and they weren't suddenly working against the very goals they were put in place to achieve.
Thank you. Mr. Martian.
Yeah, I agree with Rob wholeheartedly in his approach, but I would like to add something. I think AI, again, I'm kind of going back to this issue that AI is a tool. It's kind of like having going to a surgeon and saying, which scope do you use? Do you use a GE scope or a Siemens scope when you perform surgery, and then making a judgment on which surgeon to use based upon that? I don't think AI should be used in that format, because politics is a human function, not a technology function. Politics is about, in democracy, is about gaining constituencies and gaining a sense, as Rob pointed out, to make better decision-making process. And I agree with him. It's probably better used not so much for political reasons and decision-making process, but basically enforcing laws on the books and finding out who are getting data so that we can determine who are the people that need to be regulated and best regulated properly. The minute you use it in the political system, and somebody's out there trying to gain votes, I think, especially what we've seen, this form of nationalism around the world and in the United States, by the way, my concern is that politicians would use it for ill use, not for the purpose we might all want it to be intended for, which is for getting to better decision-making processes, both political and non-political. I think artificial intelligence and AI is a tool that is best used in a democracy to actually help implement the policies of and laws of a government, as opposed to the political decision-making process. Political decision-making process, you look at it, just look at what's going on in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress. It's highly convoluted. The people are pretty much on one side of the ledger, either influenced by money or votes. And money influences votes. So I could see somebody using artificial intelligence to use it as a tool to determine how to funnel money from one source to another, and hide that money so that they could be gain more power politically. I don't think that's a good idea. I think we need to keep in mind, in any country around the world, if you're going to put into place political decision-making process, it should be based upon a set of rules of law, and the rules of law are not artificial intelligence. So I think, artificial intelligence can help, but I think it's a tool like any other. And I don't think that people go to a surgeon and say, which tool do you use to make the decision? They want to know, is the surgeon competent? How many successes has he had in his surgery? And how many people survived, and how many people have gotten back on their feet and become healthy? So I think that's the key there, in my opinion.
Okay. Professor David Smith.
What is interesting to me in this discussion is that early in my career, I was a legislative aide to a senior state senator in Texas, and got to see the political process up close and firsthand. And as we've talked about AI, we've looked as a tool that the people doing the governance would use themselves. My experience is that the actual legislature use very few of the tools, and that it's the staff who uses the tools to help get them prepared. And as I talked about, and as Rob talked about earlier, the lobbyists actually do a lot of helping the staff get prepared for their senator, their legislative member, and everything else, because the lobbyists will bring you research and use it that way. Now, on the other hand, I was appointed to one of the state commissioners by the governor back when Bush was governor of the state of Texas. And I could see as a commissioner over one of the state agencies using artificial intelligence all the time. Particularly as a commissioner, we were very part-time. You know, it's not a full-time position. We came in, we heard recommendations from the staff. An agenda was published a week before, which was supposed to be our prep time. But as we heard things from staff and from other interested parties, we really didn't have the tools on the DS to be able to apply what we could with artificial intelligence. So I agree 100% with what Rob said, based on personal experience, that in a regulatory body, a lot of application for AI. As a commissioner in a quasi leadership, I could have used the AI tools to really help make my votes much better. But again, it's that fuzzy area, and the biases are there. When a lobbyist brings you research, you know their bias. You know their bias is their client. With AI, it's not as clear because AI doesn't have the client to give you the information, but yet it was programmed by humans, and so it will have that human bias in it from one side or the other. And that's going to be the grand challenge we need to work through as we try to apply artificial intelligence to governance.
Thank you. Professor Rob, one thing yes, we know that artificial intelligence as a tool we utilize in different areas. Yes, politics is very important. But in terms of capacity, even today's discussion, we are observing that in terms of capacity, there are a lot of questions. What do you think? How actually AI improving it can solve many complex problem, or it's like only the dream for the people?
Oh, it can. It's being applied in solving complex problems today. The issue is particularly when you're talking about one of the newer deep learning systems, the time it takes to train it and the amount of data that you have to use to do the training is significant. And so often it is the cost of creating the system, not buying the system, but actually training the system that becomes daunting, and that cost is both in money and time. And often people are expecting the AI to spin up in a matter of days, and it often can take months to years. The methodology for doing this has been improving to get those data pools down and speed up the training, but it's still a fairly onerous process. And the AIs, we're still kind of in the targeted side of the AI development scheme, where each AI is brought up and it's fairly unique. NVIDIA just launched their Transformer series of AIs, which is one of the first broad AIs, which lowers the cost of the hardware, but doesn't necessarily lower the cost or the effort surrounding the training. And that's where a lot of the effort now needs to go. It's been much easier to justify the AI training for sales tools, predominantly because there's a direct relationship between close rates and the use of AI that's very positive and supports the underlying investment. But it's harder to justify AI applied in some other areas because the monetary benefits are much harder to categorize. You make the right decision over a wrong decision. The benefits of that decision, depending on what it is, may not be seen for a number of months, number of years back. You may not even know for sure if the decision was statistically, even though it was statistically better, whether the decision actually worked out better or not, depending on your data capture mechanism at the back end. So the nature of AI right now is that where it seems to be most successfully applied is in areas where you can most successfully capture the benefits that it is achieving. making the budget and time necessary to create it far more easily justified. And so that's kind of the issue, particularly in politics, that you have to work with. Is one, a lot of politicians already think they know the right answers, so they're probably questioning whether they need AI to begin with. And number two, those politicians often would use AI to support a decision already made, as opposed to help them make a better decision. Once again, making it kind of questionable why you'd want to fund the effort. And then number three, our ability to measure the post impact of decisions is much too limited at the moment, and our willingness to do so, because how many people do you know want to spend a lot of money with a possible chance that that money is going to result in a documented finding that what you did was wrong. So all of those work against AI in politics from the standpoint of getting it adequately funded, supported, and assured. So it isn't an area that I would recommend applying AI right now. It could do a huge amount of good. I just don't think the deployments are going to be successful. Much better apply AI in more circumspect areas where the good and bad is more easily defined, and where the people are motivated more to do the right thing as opposed to being reelected and cover up problems, which is an inherent problem to politics, and one where AI could actually make things worse instead of better if it was misapplied.
Thank you. Mr. Marshall, are you with me? Mr. Marshall? Oh.
Yeah, I'm here. Okay.
Okay. You are from business industry. Basically, what Professor David Smith said that actually about the lobby. Many times, actually, business organizations and they utilize lobby, especially in U.S. economy and for U.S. politics. So, what do you think? Like in the future, business organization also develop their own AI for convince government or taking that decision? What do you think? Is it possible?
I think it's already happening, by the way. So to give you an example, I didn't attend physically, but I was involved in COP26, which is the big meeting that took place around the world in Glasgow, Scotland, for the climate crisis. And I had one of my folks on site in one of the meetings, and some statistics that are very interesting. Obviously, the most number of people from any one country that were attending this were from Glasgow, Scotland, or Scotland itself in the UK. The next large population were U.S. citizens, and the next large population were Chinese, which surprised a lot of people because of what the conference was about. The next largest population were not anybody, were people that were lobbyists for the oil and gas industry, the coal industry, big ag, and big chemical. And they were actually there with their checkbooks, sending out money, spending a lot of money, trying to influence people's to not be a part of this adoption of the COP26 plans. So politics plays a role both internationally and also in the U.S., and I'm sure as well as in other countries around the world and developing world. So money talks. So the question is, what do you do? How does the lobbyist use artificial intelligence? They're already using it. They're going to implement it, and it's going to grow in use. So it goes back to what Rob was talking about. And I think what David Smith was talking about with his experience working for the governor panels for state of Texas, and my experience in the state of New York. And that is the tools are only as good as the people using them and their intentions. So you can use a surgical scalpel to help heal people. You can also use a surgical scalpel to kill people. So at the end of the day, artificial intelligence is a tool. It has to be used for lobbying. Used in such a way to be regulated to a certain extent for government use and that use. With regard to science and business, it's going to be used. It's already being used in many regards, as Rob pointed out, and gave classic examples of it. And it's developing. It's going to develop. It's not like we're going to stop the use of artificial intelligence. That's not the issue. The issue is how can it be best used, and does it need to be regulated at all? So that's my 2 cents on that. 2 US cents, not Euro cents.
Okay. Professor David Smith. Yeah.
Well, one of the downsides of beginning to use artificial intelligence in politics is that one of the strongest uses of AI would be in something called sentiment analysis. And that is, what did the population think? What are their opinions? What are their sentiments? And I can tell you when we've done sentiment analysis for a government agency looking at another country, what is collected is open source information, and open source is things like what you see in social media, what you see in the press, what you see in areas like that. But what is also used when you're trying to do this type of sentiment analysis is you use intercepted emails, you use intercepted phone calls, and you collect that type of data into it as well. And so in most countries, if you were using it to do sentiment analysis against your own populace, the privacy concerns are really huge, because just by looking what's in media, in social media, in public media, we know that is extremely biased. So you need to go further than that. And like I said, when we use it as a tool to look at opinion of other countries, we do collect information that is very sensitive from a privacy standpoint. And that, I think, is going to be a challenge if you try to use it as a politician to understand the opinions of his constituency, to understand people in their district, to understand people in their state, and then try to look at a sentiment across the country. It's going to be very difficult to do in a way that I think would have meaningful use for governance and for lawmaking. And we just need to understand that going forward. And, you know, we also have so many people doing polls. Well, we know polls have some degree of reality, but then they also have a great degree of bias in them as well. So, like Rob said, like Marshall said, I had said earlier, being able to really understand those biases, collect appropriate information to let us make legitimate decisions. Those are the challenges with using AI in politics.
Thank you. Professor Rob, what is your concluding remarks? And besides that, if you give some advice for our students, especially we have many students from the developing world, those who are doing research. So for the AI, like what area they can focus, what type of paper they can develop for research.
Well, if you're writing papers, certainly papers focused on the ethics of AI would be very appropriate, particularly as applied to politics. Because as I mentioned earlier, AI, where it's being applied, is often being applied in sales because it shows a much higher close rate. That same underlying technology could be applied to pivot a populace in a number of different ways, because the underlying goal of the sales AI is to get people to do something they wouldn't otherwise normally do. And voting for a different politician or a different initiative would fall within the category where AI is very, very effective. And if AIs were used against the populace, but in this convincing fashion, so the populace was voting against their own best interest, which would be well within the AI's capability. That's probably something that should be outlawed in government, outlawed before it's done. And that horse, I believe, has probably already left the barn. So that the AI, which is a powerful tool for good or ill, is predominantly focused on good, and the efforts to convert it to a weapon against people are mitigated. There's an effort to mitigate it at the outset. And so that's, if I was in school, that's probably the area that I'd be looking into: ethics in AI, and then how do you keep AIs from becoming hostile to the very people that created them? Whether we're talking about militarized AIs or AIs trying to turn a populace against itself, that would be where I would suggest the effort needs to be made. both in terms of research and in terms of speaking out on the topic.
Thank you. Mr. Marshall, what is your concluding remarks and what you want to add? Like what type of AI actually we can utilize your industry, like you are involved with climate change related projects.
Well,
so if
I'd
you
like to
share
make,
with our
Sharif, I'd
students.
like to make two comments. One with, as my closing remarks. First of all, what Rob just brought up is a significant point. And also David pointed out the negatives of AI. It's like anything else. It can be used for good or ill will. It's depending on and as Rob pointed out, it probably needs to be regulated before the horse gets out of the barn. Yesterday, we had a whole conversation about Twitter, and Twitter is a social media outlet. It's not regulated by the same laws that, let's say, the Washington Post or the New York Times in the United States are regulated. And so one of the things I think we can take as a lesson for the students out there is that they look at how social media is being used. AI has the same potential usage. Social media can be used for ill or for good. And so I think and then under the argument of freedom of speech and freedom of the press and all this stuff, that's social media. With the artificial intelligence, it's the use of information and privatization, as David Smith pointed out. So I would say a good analogy, a good format, if you want to look at AI, we need to look at AI in itself, but compare it to how social media is being used. And that's where you're going to see, I think, the human use of tools, whether they're artificial intelligence, whether they're social media tools, modern tools of the 21st century. Look, right now you've got a war in Ukraine in which Russia has essentially convinced their own population that they're not killing anybody, or if they are, that it's all in self-defense, and they've skewed the message. They're not telling the truth. I think this is my opinion and my takeaway, my concluding remarks here, Sharif, is that at the end of the day, whether it's for climate change or for any other purpose, artificial intelligence is a tool, and it needs to be used in the service of truth, Truth, not the Russian word pravda, which has a connotation that it's not untruthful, but the true use of the truth. In other words, we need to know the facts and work under the facts. So where is that used? It's used in science-based methods, and that's where artificial intelligence can be very helpful, gathering data to treat diseases, to treat climate risks and things like that. But if you're going to be in the political realm, all you need to do is look at the climate crisis right now. And they're seeing a lot of climate deniers out there that claim it doesn't exist. And who are they? They're mostly paid by lobbyists. We saw it at COP26. They brought their checkbooks there, and they cut a lot of checks to a lot of leaders, political leaders. And so that money goes in their account, and it skews the outcomes. So I think I agree with Rob and David that artificial intelligence is only as good as the intention it's going to be used for. And in my opinion, like Rob said, we got to get it before the horse leaves the barn. That means get it regulated in each country and everywhere it needs to be used.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, what's your concluding remarks and what is your advice for our youth?
Well, let me start with a couple of remarks on this. What Marshall and Rob just said is 100% where I see this going. And you can begin to use it that way. You can begin to use it, particularly on a global basis, to be a great tool for politics. Because you're on a global basis, you're looking at enough data points to begin to make artificial intelligence a little less biased. And you will see that. Longitudinally, AI can help as you begin to look at major trends and understand those major trends. Where the challenge comes is when you get to regulatory issues that affect small subsets of the groups. And that's where lobbyists have their most power. But let me go back to the bias thing a minute ago, because it was interesting. I was having a discussion with my son yesterday, and I mentioned to him that Dr. Talib from Jordan had challenged the thought process we had in some of our talks. And he exposed the biases that we have, and he exposed his bias as we talked about it on your program, Sharif. And in, in many times, the reality is somewhere in the middle. And I actually was telling my son that that discussion with him on your program has caused me to re-examine some of my bias as well. And why am I saying it this way? Well, artificial intelligence is supposed to begin to mimic our human process. And our human process is we are constantly and continually adjusting our view of the world, our consensus of the world, what drives us in the world. And that is one of the things I think that becomes very important here. You know, I go and look at an allegory of the cave. And the allegory of the cave to me is a very interesting way when I start looking at the use of artificial intelligence, of machine learning, of image capture, of speech recognition, all in the context of politics. And you're going to have to use all of those. So to a student looking at this, it's work on the bias systems, look on being able to capture even broader. I'm on the board of a company in Greece that their collection tool now will pull analysis in 92 languages. And then it pulls it into their AI system and runs it through templates for output to help governments, countries, companies, and others manage risk and do other things like that. That same approach could be used in politics, but it's going to take a lot more work from where we are today to make it into a meaningful tool that could be used totally in the governance space. And for a student, that's a great area to do a lot of research. I can see multiple dissertations written on this topic that was chosen for today's show, Sharif. So thank you for letting me be part of it.
Thank you. Thank you. This is really great discussions, and thank you everyone for joining today's sessions. Tomorrow we have a special debate on fake news. I think Professor David Smith, you can take a lead for the government, and Professor Rob, you can take lead from the opposition. So hopefully this debate will be very interesting. And yes, today's session is very important because many of our students, they are doing research, and now they are developing AI. So hopefully with this kind of knowledge based open dialogue help them a lot to understand about artificial intelligence, and especially as it's very much oriented about the politics. Maybe this is also helpful for the developing world. But definitely there are many cultural differences in between North America or Asia, but definitely with this kind of open dialogue, we can understand each other and we can solve many complex problems. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. Thank you, Professor Rob, Mr. Marshall, and Professor David Smith for today's session. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.